One clumsy spill of Bordeaux in a gilded restaurant didn't just ruin a tuxedo. It launched a waiter into the crosshairs of a vast, dangerous web involving a high-ranking official and a top-secret security breach. The air in the Fleur Dorée was thick with the scent of truffle oil and suffocating wealth. Every surface gleamed, the crystal chandeliers throwing diamond chips of light onto white linen, the polished mahogany reflecting the strained smiles of the city's elite. I was running on 3 hours of sleep and adrenaline, trying to maintain the illusion of effortless grace while balancing a tray that felt like it weighed a ton. My real name is Alex, but tonight I was merely the phantom server delivering liquid gold to people who viewed me as furniture. My manager, Jean-Pierre, had given me the usual pre-shift lecture. Alex, tonight you walk on air. The mayor is here. His wife, Mrs. Albright, is here. Do not breathe too heavily in their direction. This is not a diner. This is diplomacy by way of vichyssoise. The Albright table was the epicenter of the room. Mayor Richard Albright, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, was holding court, his booming laugh dominating the muted clinking of silverware. Next to him sat Eleanor Albright. She was the real power in this town, sharp, impeccably dressed, and radiating an icy competence that even the waiters respected. Tonight, she wore a sapphire silk blouse that probably cost more than my annual rent. My job was simple: keep the Bordeaux flowing. I approached the table for the third time. My hands were slick with nervous sweat, despite my best efforts to wipe them on my apron between duties. The mayor was deep into a loud anecdote about zoning permits. Eleanor was listening with a bored politeness, her attention drifting toward a slim, dark leather portfolio resting precariously close to the edge of the table. It wasn't just any portfolio. It looked official, almost military-grade secure. Jean-Pierre had whispered something about Mrs. Albright being involved in some high-level city security audit, the kind of thing where documents were treated with more reverence than the actual mayor. This file, I gathered, was crucial, sensitive, maybe even career-ending if it fell into the wrong hands. "And so," the mayor roared, slapping the table, "I told the council, you greenlight this infrastructure package or you answer to my office." The vibration traveled through the table. Eleanor leaned back slightly to avoid the spray of imaginary celebratory champagne from her husband's story. That slight movement shifted the heavy, uncorked bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux right into the path of my tray. Time didn't slow down. It fractured. I saw the trajectory. The physics were immutable. The lip of the tray caught the base of the bottle. It wasn't a gentle nudge. It was a violent shove. The bottle tilted and gravity seized control. A cascade of deep, velvety red wine launched itself upward and outward, a liquid projectile aimed squarely at the table's most expensive occupant. For a split second, I saw the horror dawn in Eleanor Albright's eyes, not just about the ruined silk, but about the portfolio. The initial spray hit the mayor's immaculate tuxedo jacket, but the main payload, the darkest, most staining part of the disaster, struck the leather portfolio. The deep red soaked instantly into the expensive hide, then pooled and spread, seeping down the edges of the papers inside. The room went silent. The symphony of high society chatter just stopped. Even the sound of ice clinking in distant glasses seemed offensively loud. I froze, the empty tray still clutched in my white-knuckled grip. The smell of expensive wine mixed with the acrid tang of pure panic. "Oh my God," I whispered, the words barely audible. Mayor Albright's face cycled through disbelief, then incandescent rage. He didn't yell immediately. He looked down at his ruined jacket with the slow, devastating realization of a man whose entire evening, perhaps his entire carefully constructed image, had just been baptized in Merlot. Then Eleanor moved. It wasn't the reaction of a woman whose expensive blouse was ruined. It was the reaction of someone whose secrets had just been exposed to the air. Her hand shot out, not toward the wine spill, but toward the sodden portfolio. She snatched it up, her movements jerky, desperate. "Get him out of here, now," she hissed at the maitre d', her voice dangerously low, yet carrying the weight of absolute authority. But it was too late. The wine was already bleeding through the leather, and as she lifted the folder, the saturated front edge buckled, and a single, damp, folded piece of paper slid out from between the now ruined sheets and fluttered down onto the pristine white tablecloth, right in front of the mayor's untouched bread plate. It wasn't just a receipt or a napkin. It was a thick, official-looking document folded once, and even through the dark stain of the wine, I could clearly make out the bold, stamped heading. Classified, Internal Security Review, Operation Nightshade. Mayor Albright's eyes, wide with shock a moment before, narrowed with sudden, cold comprehension. He didn't look at me, the clumsy waiter. He looked at his wife. And then his gaze dropped to the soaked, exposed paper detailing something called Operation Nightshade. "Eleanor," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "what is that?" Eleanor didn't answer. Her face was ashen. She tried to reach for the paper, but the mayor's hand clamped down on her wrist, stopping her cold. The silence stretched, thick and terrifying. I stood there, the instrument of this domestic and professional explosion, knowing that the chaos I had created had just unearthed something far worse than a ruined dress. I had spilled wine, and in doing so, I might have just exposed a governmental secret. I could already feel the heavy hand of the law, perhaps even an investigation involving the Service of Internal Security, descending upon this exclusive little room, all because of one clumsy moment. The mayor's grip on Eleanor's wrist was iron. His rage had evaporated, replaced by a chilling focus that made the earlier roaring look like a child's tantrum. He leaned in, his eyes fixed on the wine-darkened document lying between us. "Operation Nightshade," he repeated, tasting the words as if they were poison. "That's the new monitoring initiative for city contracts. I thought that file was locked down at the annex." His voice was barely a breath, a stark contrast to the booming sound that had characterized his earlier conversation. Eleanor finally found her voice, strained and desperate. "Richard, calm down. It's nothing. Just preliminary findings. It's confidential, yes, but confidential enough to be smuggled into a 5-star restaurant in a briefcase you're guarding like the crown jewels?" He cut her off. He glanced at me, a flicker of utter contempt in his eyes, before looking back at his wife. "And why are you the one carrying it? This is outside your remit, Eleanor. Unless you've been digging where you weren't supposed to?" The accusation hung heavy in the suddenly freezing air. The other diners, sensing a real drama unfolding, were pretending to be intensely interested in their own appetizers, but their ears were clearly straining in our direction. Jean-Pierre was hovering near the kitchen entrance, his face a mask of professional terror, clearly signaling security to approach without being obvious. I knew I had to move. Remaining a statue was a good way to become collateral damage. I took a tentative step back, intending to retreat toward the relative safety of the service station, perhaps grab a napkin, anything to look like I was still performing a duty. "Sir, madam, I am profoundly sorry," I managed, my voice trembling slightly despite my efforts to sound contrite. "Let me bring towels. I can try to clean this immediately." "Silence!" Mayor Albright snapped, not even looking at me. Eleanor, however, saw my retreat as an opportunity. With a sudden, surprising surge of strength, she yanked her arm free of his grasp, causing him to stumble slightly. She lunged forward, a predator reclaiming its territory, and snatched the wet document from the tablecloth. She tried to cram it back into the ruined portfolio, her hands shaking violently. "It's fine, Richard. I'll handle this," she insisted, trying to project calm while clearly panicking internally. "It's just paperwork. Nothing that concerns you right now." That was the trigger. The mayor stood up fully, pushing his chair back so hard it scraped loudly across the marble floor. He was a tall man, and in that moment he seemed immense, casting a long shadow over his terrified wife and the wreckage of the dinner. Nothing that concerns me? Eleanor, this investigation touches everything. It's about the allocation of those federal infrastructure funds, the very cornerstone of my campaign. He lowered his voice again, but the intensity was staggering. I told you, stay out of the deep dives. Let the auditors do their work. If you found something damning enough to warrant this level of secrecy, you tell me first, or you let the investigation run its course. As he spoke, a heavy-set man in an ill-fitting suit, clearly not a professional waiter, detached himself from a nearby booth and began moving deliberately toward our table. This wasn't Jean-Pierre's security staff. This man had the coiled tension of someone whose job was far more specialized and less polite than serving creme brulee. He was making a beeline for the mayor, a subtle urgency in his stride that screamed official business, the kind of official business that involved questioning people in quiet back rooms. Eleanor saw the man approaching. Her eyes flickered from the menacing newcomer to the file in her hands. She made a decision in that split second, a terrible, instinctive choice fueled by self-preservation. She didn't try to hide the file. She didn't try to explain. Instead, she did the only thing that would instantly draw all attention away from the document and onto herself, and perhaps, just perhaps, give her the split second she needed to escape. She looked me dead in the eye, the lowly, terrified waiter, and with a fierce, almost desperate intensity, she hurled the soaking wet leather portfolio directly at my chest. It struck me hard enough to knock the air from my lungs, the wine-soaked leather slapping against my uniform shirt. The impact wasn't the cliffhanger. The real shock was what happened next. As I stumbled back, clutching the ruined evidence bag, Eleanor took advantage of the distraction, spinning on her heel and bolting. Not toward the exit, but deeper into the exclusive velvet-roped private dining area reserved for city council members, leaving her husband standing there, stunned, facing a man who looked like he meant business, and me, the convenient scapegoat, holding the proof of some major internal conflict. "Stop her!" Mayor Albright roared, finally breaking his shocked silence. But he wasn't yelling at the approaching suited man. He was yelling at the fleeing shadow of his wife. Then, the suited man's attention snapped to me. He saw the file in my hands, the wine, the panic. Before I could utter another apology, the man was closing the distance, his face grim. "You," he barked, pointing directly at me, "drop the bag and put your hands where I can see them. You are now part of an ongoing internal investigation regarding this material." The man who called himself Agent Miller was all sharp edges and tailored gray wool. His movement was economical. One moment he was 10 feet away, the next his hand was clamped onto my forearm with bone-crushing force. The wet portfolio dug painfully into my ribs. Mayor Albright, realizing his wife was making a clean getaway into the maze of private dining rooms, let out a frustrated curse and turned his attention fully to Miller, clearly assessing the threat level of this uniformed interruption. "Agent," the mayor said, attempting to regain control, his voice already adopting the smooth, authoritative tone he used on television. "There seems to be a slight misunderstanding. This is a catering mishap. I will handle the retrieval of that." He paused, clearly realizing he couldn't acknowledge the document's nature in front of a room full of potential witnesses. "The personal effects of my wife. I assure you, this young man is merely a clumsy employee." Miller didn't even look at the mayor. His focus remained entirely on me, the accidental carrier of classified information. His grip tightened until I could feel the blood draining from my hand. "Sir, with respect," Miller said, his voice devoid of inflection, "this situation has been flagged. We were monitoring Mrs. Albright's movements regarding Operation Nightshade. Any unauthorized transfer of materials requires immediate securing of the recipient. You will step away, Mayor. This individual is coming with me." "Unauthorized transfer?" the mayor sputtered, his face darkening again. "You are suggesting my wife is compromised? I will have your badge for this kind of accusation." I was caught in a vice grip between a powerful politician claiming ownership of the evidence and a government agent claiming jurisdiction over it. All I wanted was to be back folding napkins in the dish pit, invisible and irrelevant. "Sir, I didn't touch anything intentionally," I tried to plead, looking past Miller to the mayor. "I'm just a student working double shifts. I don't know what Operation Nightshade is. I just spilled the wine." Miller shoved me forward toward a side exit typically reserved for deliveries. "Save it for the debriefing. If you try to run, I will treat you as hostile." As we moved through the swinging kitchen doors, the cacophony of clattering pots and shouting chefs provided a momentary, blessed shield from the high society silence of the dining room. Miller marched me through the service hallways, past mountains of soiled linens and greasy prep stations, until we reached a utility closet tucked behind the ice machine. He practically threw me inside and slammed the door shut. The closet smelled overwhelmingly of bleach and stale mop water. It was tight, dark, and offered no escape route. Miller pulled out a government-issued phone, sleek, black, and intimidating, and spoke into it in low, urgent tones. "Package secured. Witness secured. Mayor Albright is being uncooperative, attempting to claim privilege. Requesting immediate extraction team at the rear loading bay. Discreet transport ready. We need to move him before the press gets wind of the disturbance." He hung up and finally turned his full, chilling attention to me. He gestured sharply toward the soggy portfolio still clutched against my chest. "Give me the item, slowly." I carefully handed over the ruined leather. Miller inspected the wine stains, his expression unreadable, before tucking the whole mess into a heavy-duty evidence bag he produced from an inner pocket. "Now, listen carefully, Alex," he said, reading my name tag, which suddenly felt like a beacon announcing my doom. "You are not under formal arrest, yet, but you are a material witness in an investigation into the potential leakage of highly sensitive city infrastructure planning. This means you are currently under protective custody. You will answer our questions, and you will tell the truth. Any attempt to contact friends, family, or social media about this evening will be construed as tampering with an investigation concerning a grave threat to public stability." He paused, letting the weight of grave threat settle over me. I could practically taste the seriousness of the accusation. It sounded like they were pinning something far beyond simple negligence on this entire mess, maybe even suggesting a link to those heavy charges related to undermining state operations. "If I cooperate," I managed, my voice a dry rasp. "If you cooperate, you may avoid a very long stay in a federal facility while we determine if you are merely an idiot waiter or an accessory to espionage," Miller stated flatly. "Now, we need to get you out of here before the mayor decides to mobilize his own contacts." Just as Miller finished speaking, a loud, insistent banging erupted from the utility closet door. It wasn't the gentle knocking of a busboy looking for supplies. It was a rhythmic, powerful pounding that shook the thin metal door. "Open this door! Service staff, clear the rear corridor immediately!" bellowed a voice I recognized immediately. Jean-Pierre, the manager, now clearly working in tandem with the mayor's people. Miller swore under his breath. "They're moving faster than anticipated. They want to get to you before we do." He looked around the tiny closet, his eyes darting from the mop bucket to the stack of old cleaning rags. He shoved me back against the wall, closer to the overflowing mop sink. "Stay quiet. Do not move. If they open this door, you are a pile of discarded cleaning supplies. Do you understand?" The banging intensified. The metal door actually warped slightly inward. Miller flattened himself against the door, his hand instinctively moving toward his jacket, a sign that this situation was escalating beyond polite questioning and into potential physical confrontation. Then, through the thin metal, I heard a new voice cutting through Jean-Pierre's panicked shouting, a voice that was colder and sharper than even Miller's. It was Eleanor Albright. "Agent Miller," she called out, her voice echoing eerily, though she couldn't possibly know exactly where he was. "You have evidence that does not belong to you. Hand over the materials now, or I will personally ensure your entire department faces an inquiry for illegal surveillance. You think you're protecting the city? You're destroying my husband's career over a clerical error. Give me the file, or I promise you, you will be the one answering to the charge of attempting to subvert a high-ranking official with a fabricated, heavy accusation." Eleanor's voice, laced with fury and the authority of a woman who knew exactly where the bodies were buried, seemed to vibrate the very air in the utility closet. Miller tensed, his entire frame rigid against the door, clearly caught between two powerful opposing forces. He had been prepared for the mayor's bluster. He was not prepared for Eleanor's strategic counterattack, delivered with surgical precision from behind a locked door. "She's running interference," Miller muttered to me, his gaze intense, assessing whether I could be trusted to hold still for 3 more seconds. "She's trying to draw us out so she can secure the witness, or silence him." The pounding stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs. Then came a new sound, the metallic click of a lock being tampered with, coming not from the utility closet door, but from the main kitchen access door further down the hall. They weren't trying to break in, they were flanking us. "They have a key override for this section," Miller hissed, pulling his government phone back out. "I need to call backup, now." As he thumbed the screen, Eleanor spoke again, her voice now closer, as if she were right outside the service hallway entrance. "Mr. Miller, you have 5 seconds to hand over the evidence bag to my associate waiting outside the service entrance. Refusal will be interpreted as obstruction of justice related to the ongoing security review. We have recordings of your entire unwarranted pursuit of Mr. Albright's staff." It was a magnificent bluff, or perhaps, terrifyingly, not a bluff at all. Miller hesitated, his finger hovering over the call button. He was trapped between protocol and the very real threat of career obliteration orchestrated by the city's first family. The choice between a difficult extraction and a career-ending administrative nightmare was stark. "If I give it to her, you're implicated," Miller warned me, his voice dangerously low. "If I don't, we might get cornered by the mayor's private security detail before my team arrives." I stared at the metal door, imagining the faces on the other side, the enraged mayor, the calculating Eleanor, and Jean-Pierre, who would certainly frame me for the entire disaster to save his restaurant's exclusive catering contract. "I don't care who gets the file," I whispered fiercely. "Just get me out of here. I'm an innocent bystander. I just want to go home." Miller seemed to make his decision. He stuffed the phone back into his jacket. Instead of opening the door to face Eleanor's associate, he looked up. Above us, barely visible in the gloom of the closet, was a small, square ventilation grate, caked with decades of dust and grease. It was probably too small for a grown man, but perhaps not for a desperate, sleep-deprived waiter. "New plan," Miller said, grabbing a nearby heavy-duty metal pipe, a squeegee handle perhaps, and jamming it under the bottom edge of the ventilation grate. With a grunt of effort, he wrenched the grate free. It fell onto a stack of empty buckets with a deafening clang that momentarily drowned out the renewed hammering on the door. "Up," Miller ordered, pointing. "Go up now. Do not make noise. I will create a diversion." The opening was small, barely 18 inches square. I scrambled onto the precarious tower of cleaning supplies, ignoring the agonizing scrape of metal against my ribs as I tried to push my shoulders through the narrow gap. I felt like I was trying to force my way out of a coffin. As I squeezed my torso through, I heard the utility closet door finally give way with a screech of tearing metal, followed by the sound of heavy boots entering the small space. "He's getting away!" someone yelled. I thought it was Jean-Pierre. "Stop him!" Miller commanded, and I heard the distinct sound of a struggle, punctuated by a heavy impact, like a body hitting the metal shelving unit. I wormed my head and one arm free into the dark, dusty space above the ceiling tiles. I could hear muffled shouts below me, muffled because the ceiling tiles were thick, but the chaos was escalating rapidly. I pulled my other shoulder through just as a bright, blinding beam of light from a tactical flashlight swept across the space directly beneath me. "There he is! Get him down!" Miller's voice, strained but still commanding, rose above the din. I kicked wildly, propelled by pure terror, and tumbled onto the dusty insulation between the ceiling joists. The fall wasn't far, but it was uncontrolled. I landed awkwardly, sending a cascade of plaster dust and insulation fibers raining down onto the scene below. I crawled frantically on my hands and knees across the narrow wooden beams, trying to put distance between myself and the closet opening. The light followed me, jerking erratically as Miller and the mayor's men wrestled below. And then I saw it. Peering down through a small gap in the tiles where one had shifted, I saw the source of the true danger. It wasn't just Mayor Albright's hired muscle anymore. 2 other figures had entered the kitchen area, distinct from Miller's initial backup, moving with professional swiftness that Miller's earlier team didn't possess. They wore dark, tactical vests, and they weren't looking for Miller. They were looking directly at the hole in the ceiling, their weapons raised. But they weren't aiming at me. They were aiming past me, at Agent Miller, who was currently pinned against a shelf, disarmed, wrestling with one of the mayor's security guards. One of the newcomers spoke into a headset, his voice cold and amplified by the tactical microphone. "Package secured. Target Miller is neutralized. We are extracting the waiter who handled the material. Confirming hostile agency presence. Proceeding with acquisition of witness." The realization slammed into me like a physical blow. I wasn't just an accidental waiter who spilled wine. I was the key to Operation Nightshade, and I was now being hunted by people far more dangerous than the mayor, people who wanted to clean up every loose end, including the clumsy server who had brought the secrets into the light. The tactical flashlight from below swung up, catching my terrified face in its blinding glare, just as the first of the dark-vested figures started climbing the shelving unit directly beneath me. The beam of the tactical light seared my eyes, freezing me mid-crawl on the dusty joist. Below me, the struggle had dissolved into a tense standoff. Agent Miller, though clearly overpowered by the mayor's muscle, and now facing the heavily armed, unidentified operatives, still held his ground, trying to shield the general area where I had just disappeared. "This operation is under internal security jurisdiction," Miller yelled up at the new arrivals, a desperate attempt to assert authority over men who clearly recognized no authority but their own. "Stand down. You are interfering with a federal inquiry." The leader of the dark-vested team ignored him completely. His eyes, cold and flat, were fixed on the gap where I was currently lodged. He didn't raise his weapon yet. He was observing, calculating the safest extraction. I knew, with a clarity born of sheer terror, that they weren't interested in questioning me. They were interested in permanent silence. My clumsy mistake had inadvertently stumbled upon something so toxic that governments, or whatever shadowy organization this was, were willing to risk a public brawl in a restaurant kitchen to control the narrative. I had seconds. The ceiling tiles were old, brittle, and coated in decades of grime. I could feel the vibrations as the man below me started to climb the unstable metal shelving unit. If he reached the ceiling, I was finished. I looked down the narrow corridor of the ceiling space. It extended perhaps 20 feet before hitting a main structural beam, beyond which lay the dark, unexplored territory of the ventilation shaft leading toward the restaurant's exterior wall. It was a desperate gamble, fueled by the realization that surrender meant oblivion. Gathering every ounce of adrenaline, I didn't crawl forward. I threw myself backward, away from the encroaching light and the climbing figures. I slammed hard into the main beam, the impact jarring every joint, but it put distance between me and the immediate threat. I scrambled over the beam, ignoring the sharp tear of fiberglass insulation catching on my clothes, and plunged into the utter blackness of the main ductwork. It was a tight squeeze, but the ceiling space offered freedom of movement Miller and the others lacked. I heard an enraged shout from below as they realized I had fled deeper into the building's infrastructure. "He's in the vents! Seal the roof access and the exhaust ports," the dark-vested leader barked. The race was on. I crawled blindly, guided only by the faint memory of the building's layout from my brief time serving drinks near the storerooms. I could hear the frantic sounds of pursuit echoing through the metal structure, heavy footsteps dragging across the tile below, and the terrifying metallic scraping of access panels being removed somewhere nearby. Then I heard a sound that gave me a sliver of hope, the distant, fading wail of sirens. Not the sharp chirp of private security, but official, legitimate law enforcement responding to the chaos Jean-Pierre must have called in when the fighting started. I reached the end of the ductwork, feeling for the metal seams of the external vent cover. My fingers found the rusted screws. They were old, but stubborn. Below me, the sounds of the conflict intensified. Gunshots, muffled but unmistakable. Miller was fighting for time, or perhaps for his life, while I was the prize they were fighting over. With a final, desperate surge of strength, I jammed the end of the discarded metal pipe, which I'd somehow managed to drag with me, into the seam of the vent cover and wrenched. The rusted screws screamed in protest before one finally gave way. I kicked the cover hard. It flew outward with a loud clatter, landing on the damp concrete alleyway outside. Cool night air rushed in, smelling of garbage and freedom. I didn't hesitate. I slid out onto the narrow ledge, ignoring the dizzying height, and dropped the final 8 feet into the relative safety of the back alley, just as the first police cruiser screeched to a halt at the restaurant's main entrance, lights flashing frantically. I didn't run toward the main street. I ran the other way, deeper into the service tunnels, shedding my ruined waiter's jacket and wiping the worst of the insulation from my face. I was covered in grime, smelling like chlorine and fear, but I was alive, and I was free. I found an unsecured basement stairwell leading to a quieter residential street 2 blocks over. I kept moving until I reached a brightly lit public square, melting into the early morning crowd of joggers and early commuters. I bought the cheapest coffee I could find, trying to look like any other exhausted student. The next day, the news was dominated by a major security incident at Le Fleur Dorée. The official story was baffling. A large-scale brawl erupted between rival catering staff following a dispute over an inventory mix-up. Mayor Albright was quoted looking stern but composed, praising the swift response of private security and dismissing reports of any sensitive documents being involved. Agent Miller and the mayor's security personnel were nowhere to be seen in the coverage. As for Eleanor Albright, she was never mentioned. Operation Nightshade was scrubbed from the public discourse. But I had seen the file. I had heard the accusations. I knew the truth of the struggle. I was no longer just Alex, the student waiter. I was the only living, breathing piece of evidence that the entire narrative being sold to the public was a carefully constructed lie to cover up a massive breach of public trust. I sat in a cramped, borrowed apartment the next week, watching a muted television report showing Mayor Albright smiling confidently at a press conference, promising fiscal transparency. On the coffee table lay the only physical proof I possessed, a single, small, water-damaged corner of official stationery, torn from the main document when I yanked the portfolio away. The ink was smeared, but the crisp, official stamp of the city seal was partially visible. I picked up my burner phone, purchased with the last of my saved tips, and opened a secure, encrypted browser. I knew the city security people would eventually track down the restaurant's employment records and find me. I had maybe 24 hours before the real cleanup crew came looking for the loose end who crawled out of the ceiling. I typed out a short, anonymous message to the city's most notoriously aggressive investigative reporter, a woman who had been gunning for the mayor for years. The message was simple, attaching the grainy photo of the official seal fragment. Dinner chaos wasn't about wine, Ask Eleanor Albright about Operation Nightshade and the missing infrastructure funds. I have the full story, and I'm ready to talk. Asterisk. I hit send. The screen confirmed delivery. My heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with the terrifying certainty that I had just thrown the match onto the dry tinder of city politics. I was exposed, hunted, and about to detonate a scandal that could bring down the mayor. The quiet life of a waiter was over. I had stepped into the spotlight of high-stakes exposure, and there was no turning back now.